and record this and get it for the students at home. And my political science class at home now is my number one class in terms of size, and they're doing great. So definitely shout out to the students at home. You can do this class very successfully from home should you need to. And a big shout out, a wave to them as we record this lecture for them. Okay. All right. Well, let's go ahead and jump in. Before we get too far in, I want to tell you that, we got an election now is 15 days away. And there's supposed to be another debate on Thursday. Been a fascinating campaign. It's actually getting tighter and closer as we get close to election day, which you totally expect, by the way. But anyway, be following that with your family and your friends, and follow that election. Also, I had to make a decision looking at the fact that we're 19 lectures in, and we only get 2 days versus 5 to teach this class. So we're going to have to leave certain things out. So made the decision, we're just going to do a good job with the things we cover them in pretty good detail, because I think that'll be better. You'll remember that better than if we just try to quickly cover everything. That can get just a little crazy to cover every little thing and try to remember all these details. So we're going to focus a little more like we did on the Greeks. I thought that went well. We're going to focus on the Romans. And so I'm going to divide it up. It'll probably be 5 or 6 lectures now. So this lecture right here, we'll combine it with Wednesday's lecture and Thursday's lecture. And then we'll have a study guide on the first half of Rome. And then we'll have another study guide at the end of Rome. And that should probably be better for you and for also retention of knowledge. And besides, the Romans can teach us more than probably anybody else about ourselves, because they have been studied and studied and studied, and they went through so much. We're talking, if you count Byzantium, we're talking nearly 2,000 years of history here, maybe longer. And they went through every possible thing you can imagine. I'm putting this slide back up here again to show you how they started as a simple, humble, little tiny city-state that was beat up by its neighbors, the Etruscans, quite a lot, that the Latin tribes around them were often trouble. But they managed to turn into the most, I would say, successful empire of the classical period of antiquity. And then, of course, they broke into halves, and the other second half continued to be Roman, continued to survive much longer, as we call Byzantium, but they would have considered themselves Romans. So once again, we're looking at 2,900 or 200 BCE. Now we're heading toward 0 here. And at around just before 0, they turn into an empire run by an emperor, a single ruler, an autocrat, which had not been their history because they were very anti-monarchy and so on. So just one more time through that. Okay, well, also too, we know that these are the people of the toga, and it was probably from the Etruscans where they got the style itself. They borrowed a lot from the Etruscans earlier. You can imagine a couple of hundred years living next to a neighbor that was more advanced than you were, wealthier than you were, and oftentimes controlled you. You're going to pick up some things. And maybe even the gladiatorial contests, certainly chariot racing was Etruscan in origin, and the Romans loved chariot racing. That was like their favorite thing, right? And then also too, this gladiatorial contest to the death, it started out as an Etruscan funeral ritual, which seems a little weird. So you go to a funeral and then 2 people fight to the death, in front of the crowd. Seems a little odd. But nonetheless, Romans would have these gladiatorial contests too, sometimes against animals, especially lions. They loved lions. And the lion, of course, always ended up on the wrong end of the spear, so to speak. But not before sometimes people were succumbed to the lions and things like that. And so pretty barbaric in all respects. Makes bullfighting seem tame, which still is kind of crazy. But nonetheless, there you go. And so one of the things was the toga. Now remember, only citizens could wear the toga, right? You had to be a certain class. And if you were of the senatorial class, which means somebody in your family had risen to this level of Senate, you could have a purple stripe in yours. So when you walked down the street, people thought you were more important. And you were, because you had more wealth and power usually. And people were divided not just by their class, but by their clothing. The patricians, the rich aristocrat, landowning class, the slaves, the legionnaires, of course, and the plebeians were the working class people. All right, well, that's by way of review. And you know that from 509 to 46 BCE, until they were taken over by Julius Caesar, basically we have a 500-year period where they would have called themselves a republic, meaning the patrician class, the people allowed to wear the purple toga, they ran the show. And there were usually only about 250 to 500, sometimes it was more in later periods, senators that made all the decisions. But it wasn't one ruler, it wasn't a monarch. It was a broader group of people, which we would call today oligarchy. All right, well, save that for poli sci, but that's kind of what it was. So let's review then the three tiers of citizenship. So you had some citizens that were more important than others. Those would be the aristocratic landowning class called the Senate, right? But everybody got to participate in the assembly. And they were kind of divided in tribes kind of thing, and a little bit like you saw in Athens. But this was different. They could give input and they could have tribunes go represent them in the Senate, but the Senate had control. So even though there's this democratic branch of the Roman government where everybody could have a say, it was a limited say. Whereas in Athens, it was a direct say, very different. And they then, of course, had two consuls. So instead of kind of like the Spartans in this regard, where they had two kings, here they have two consuls. They acted like kings for a year. But that was a big difference too, because monarchs are hereditary usually, father to son, so to speak, sometimes to a daughter, but rarely. So this was their way to divide power. And you had to get reelected as a consul every year. So that was kind of what we would call a check and a balance. So two consuls served 1-year terms, and they would often be the military leaders too, the chief commanding officers, and would go out and conquer territories. Okay, moving right along, you see that then power is really top down. Consuls have the control for their 1 year. The Senate makes the decisions, and the assembly has very little power. Tribunes could intercede on behalf of the masses. Remember, this is the bulk of the populations down here in the assembly, but they had less power than the smaller group and even smaller group. So it was like an upside down pyramid. Understand, though, Romans believed in a thing called the course of honor, where you worked your way up to consul. And then you had dignitas. We talked about dignitas last time being this course of honor where you accumulated coolness, you accumulated greatness, status, prestige, notoriety, fame, celebrity, reputation, power, wealth. All of it together is the measure of your importance, and that is your dignitas. And the Romans literally would sacrifice their life to expand the dignitas because it extended to your family. Your family would have that dignitas from that point on. If you were successful in war, you remembered for it. For example, there was one guy that conquered North Africa, Scipio, and they called him Scipio Africanus. And that title persisted through their family's history. But remember, fame is fleeting because it's a zero-sum game. So essentially, if somebody else gets more dignitas, that means you're, by definition, going to get less, which is, makes the Romans very competitive. Now I'm going to reintroduce somebody who we brought in the very first lecture. His name was Cicero, right? Cicero was a Roman author, orator, politician, orator, somebody who speaks, very famous. A lot of his stuff's written down, so we have examples of it. Lived between 106 to 43. So at the tail end of the Republic, at the tail end of the Republican period. Remember this quote I read you? History is the witness that testifies to the passing of time. It illuminates reality, vitalizes memory, provides guidance in daily life, and brings us the tidings of antiquity. And I think we've shown you through the course how things in the ancient past, things in the classical past have impacted us today. And we're certainly going to do that with the Romans. All right, just want to remind you of that. There's another guy that was alive at about the same time, roughly, and his name was Livy. Now, Titus Livius, I guess is how you actually say his name. We call him Livy in English. And basically, he was a Roman historian, sort of. Roman historians often, Livy, would tie myths up with legends and call it history. So it was a little bit like whoever wrote the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? You're going to tell these heroic tales, but you say it actually did happen to a real person. So maybe it's half history, half myth. But the importance of these myths are very important, as we've been saying all the way through the course, because it sets the ideals of the community. It sets their belief structure, their religious structures, and so on. And certainly the stories being told about early Romans lived on. Livy, his book right here it is. It's called, remember when they did their calendar, it was from the beginning, the founding of the city. He wrote a book by the same name called From the Founding of the City. And this book, here is a 1715 copy of his book. We're talking 1700 years after he died. He is still being read by people who are being influenced by it. And one of those was George Washington, because George Washington would have been born shortly after this, and he would have risen to prominence in the 1750s. And this was no doubt a book he had in his library, or at least he knew the stories. All right, now let's tell about some of those people and the stories written by Livy. There was this guy, Gaius Mucius. Now, Mucius gets the nickname of, well, Mucius the Lefty, and that name stuck in his family from then on. The Lefty? Well, here's what happened. He goes to war with his pals. In fact, he's sent up to kill the king of the Etruscans. He gets caught. He gets captured. He's a prisoner of war. And the Etruscan king is going to, of course, torture him and send a message, don't mess with us kind of thing. Brings in a fiery hot cauldron, burning embers. They're just hot as can be. Brings it up, brings this guy in, this general. Going to be tortured, beg for your life, all that kind of stuff. And Mucius walks up to it and says, I am a citizen of Rome. I was sent here to fight and kill you. And I didn't succeed, but others will come. And I'm going to show you Roman courage. And he put his hand right into the cauldron, and his arm literally burned off in front of the Etruscan king. And he didn't flinch. And the Etruscan king, then, according to this myth or story, was so shocked that someone would be that fanatical that he said, let's not invade the Romans, right? Let's give them some space right now. And that story was told to show Roman courage, unflinching, and never bending, never submitting. It's quite a story. We have a story very similar in American history. It's the story of John McCain. John McCain captured North Vietnam, Vietnam War, 5.5 years in the most notorious prison in North Vietnam, called, as more of satire, called the Hanoi Hilton. That's what the people being held there called it. And he was tortured for 5.5 years. His dad was a leading admiral in the Navy, right? I'll tell this story probably to you in political science again, but such an important story because he runs for president. He becomes one of the most important senators in American history. But his father was the admiral of the Pacific Fleet. And the North Vietnamese said, we'll do a public relations thing here and we'll let him out. And he refused to go until everyone that got there before him was released first. And he goes down as one of the great heroes of American history. John McCain was the American version of Gaius Mucius. John McCain, till he died, could not lift his arms up to here. People ask, why do you hold your hands so low over your heart when you say the pledge? Because he couldn't lift his arms any higher because he'd been hung up by the ceiling for ages and ages, and it completely ripped up everything in the back that allowed him to do that. True American hero. I can tell you stories about him later. But this is the kind of story that tells a society, for example, the US military, how you should behave if you're ever captured, right? What you should do, how you should continue to resist. Here's another story. Horatius Clocus. Now, Horatius is what they call him. The thing is, Rome had a wall around it that they built around the Palatine Hill, as we told you in an earlier lecture. And then there was the river. Now, the river protected the city as well. And there was a bridge across the river. That was kind of the whole point of Rome. This was when people coming north and south would cross that bridge, have to pay a toll, trade with Rome, and before they moved on. So this was the trading point. And so they built this wonderful bridge. Well, all of a sudden, a huge Etruscan army comes over the hill to take over Rome again. Horatius sees the danger, goes out onto the bridge himself, orders all of the other Romans to start tearing the bridge apart. Hack it down, knock it down, burn it if you have to, destroy the bridge. And he alone stood out in front of that bridge, right at the end of the bridge, and fought the Etruscans personally, a huge army of the Etruscans, did his own personal Thermopylae, if you will, and managed to hold them back long enough for the bridge to be destroyed, because it was the one weak point, the Achilles heel of Rome. And then he jumped in the river, swam for safety, and survived. This idea of being cool leader under pressure and then being so brave became a Roman ideal. So the Romans were influenced by their stories as much as Homer influenced the Greeks. These stories influenced the Romans. One of my favorites, and pretty much everybody's favorite, is Lucius Cincinnatus. Lucius Cincinnatus was in the early Roman period, right? Just after they'd become a republic. And he was a landowning guy, but he didn't own much land. He owned about 3 acres or so. So he was basically a poor farmer. And most Romans at that time were just that. They were poor farmers. They didn't have yet these big estates yet and all this kind of stuff. Some had maybe more land than others. They were the senatorial class, but he was a senator and he only had 3 acres and he was getting older and he's on his farm just working away when Rome gets attacked by an enemy and one of the Roman legions gets surrounded. They're in trouble. So they run out to Lucius's farm and they knew he'd had military training. They knew he'd been successful in the past and they asked him to come and take over. Now, this is going to sound kind of odd, but I want you to listen to it. The Romans also, though, reserved in their government, if you will, a title called dictator. Dictators could only serve for 6 months. In a time of absolute crisis, they did put one person in charge. So one of the consuls was no doubt with this one army, the other consul was confused, maybe who knows what. So the Senate voted in one dictator, but to make sure that they didn't mess with society too much, it was for 6 months. Cincinnatus then got the remaining troops, got them trained, got them marched in 16 days, rescued that legion and defeated the attacking enemy. Then here's what's important about the story. You listening? He goes back to his farm and begins farming again. He didn't stay on for the next 4.5 months as dictator, taking advantage of the situation, absorbing power unto himself. He went home, establishing the ideal that the ideal Roman is not power hungry, is just a simple farmer living a very austere life. Austere means without all those little extras that rich and wealthy, powerful people get. A little bit like the Cynic philosophy, if you remember that from Diogenes. Get rid of all those things and just work hard and do your bit. But in time of danger, rise to defend your country, in this case, Rome, which he did. This story, well, it was big for the Romans, but it became big for us too, because George Washington did exactly that more than once, twice, in fact, once during the French and Indian War and another time during the American Revolution. He left his beautiful farm, Mount Vernon, goes off and fights America's battles in the American Revolution, and he could have made himself king of the United States. There were 2 times when he could have become the monarch of the United States, the leader for life. But as soon as hostilities were over, the treaty was signed, he takes his sword and he surrenders it to Congress and goes back to his farm. There's more to the story. I'll tell you that when we get to political science. But here's the thing. He is called the American Cincinnatus. In fact, for all of his efforts, they gave him some land in Ohio. And the city of Cincinnati, Ohio is named for him, the American Cincinnatus. The story was very important to him that he be seen as a citizen, farmer, who served his country well and then went back to the soil, to the land that he loved so much. He loved Mount Vernon. So these stories impact us even today. There's another Roman, very important, named Cato, who was the last senator to stand up against the emperors. And Cato would lose his life standing up to the emperors. And is it any small wonder, given that Washington grew up on Livy, these stories, grew up on the story of Cato, which was his favorite play, by the way, about this Roman who died trying to prevent the takeover of the emperors, would have such an impact on him. And when he had a chance to become king of America for life, which he had the chance more than once, he would say no. Instead, he would help write the Constitution of the United States and then create, every 4 years, we re-elect a president, so they can't be dictators for life. Now, I think that's a pretty important story today, given that we're only 15 days away from another presidential election. And so we learn from the Romans. The lessons are clear. And so that's just one of them. Now let's talk about Roman ideals, right? The ideal Roman job early was to be a farmer. They were all just small farmers living up in the hills, creating this little city that for trade and whatever. They weren't much, but they then looked down upon people that made their living in a different way, like merchants, because one of the things you had to be was honorable, right? You had to be honest in all your dealings. They had a high sense of ethics. And merchants, by nature of their job, and bankers too, who have to charge interest, kind of double deal. Maybe they're not too ethical. Maybe they cheat people. And so those jobs are actually looked down on. And you couldn't be a member of the Senate and not be an aristocratic farmer. In fact, if you asked any senator, no matter how rich they became, whether they ever held the plow in their hands or not, probably didn't later on, what is your job? What do you do? I'm a farmer, because they're pointing back to Cincinnatus. So to say anything else would be like, ooh, you're a merchant? Oh, you made your money in shipping? Oh, you made money in banking? You made money in a grubby way and not in the land itself. Very interesting in terms of the Roman values. And early on, of course, because there were so many small farmers, that's why they were able to create these legions, these Roman armies called the Roman legion, out of a citizenry of citizens who were small farmers. That was true early on. Later in Roman history, that's going to break down, and they're going to hire mercenaries. And the story we're going to tell you next is about how mercenaries can really let you down. A mercenary is a warrior who is paid to fight for your side. And mercenaries often will switch sides depending on who's paying the most money. So to have a citizen army like we do in the United States, all volunteers, service, it's a service thing. We don't hire, like let's hire the German army to fight. Oh, guess what? The British did that in the American Revolution. They hired 10,000 or more German Hessians from a little state inside Germany to come over here and fight against the American colonists during the American Revolution. One of Washington's biggest victories was against the Hessian mercenaries at the Battle of Trenton. Again, we'll talk about that in a later day. But these guys, when they started out, they had this citizen army. And they had this also, remember, this attitude that they never give in, they never give up. Regardless of the odds, they keep fighting and they rise up when needed to defend the state. Now, as the Romans began to conquer areas, the Latins, the Boot of Italy, they created military colonies. In other words, some of the legions, right, who maybe had a small farm here, were given a bigger farm over there. So they would go and mix in with the local population and be given land grants within the local population. It was one reason why Rome was able to expand citizenship and why so many of the people they conquered kind of joined in and became one with Rome rather than constantly second-class citizens all the time. Remember, they granted 2 levels of citizenship: full citizenship, half citizenship, and then just alliance. You were an ally. And all of those were good because they gave you a different level of rights that you wouldn't have had if you didn't have that right. The history of Christianity is important in terms of like Peter, right? The Apostle Peter was not part of the first 12 apostles of Jesus, but he was converted later. Saul of Tarsus later became Peter, the rock. But he was a Roman citizen. So it allowed him, when challenged, and they arrested him, to actually be sent to Rome for trial. That's why he ended up in Rome and started that church there, which is now the Vatican. So having Roman citizenship is an important thing. It gives you certain rights and freedoms that you wouldn't have had normally. So these military colonies were great, giving land grants. I'm sorry, I need to, don't know what happened there. Let's get back to that. My apologies. Let's jump ahead a little bit. So giving land grants then was kind of important. And then sending them to be farmers, and then sending Roman administrators. They divided their empire into a thing called dioceses, right? Which is still a term used today in the Roman Catholic Church, where they have a diocese with an archbishop, and then they have smaller parishes and so on. But this whole idea of a diocese. So a little bit like the Persians, where they had the satraps and the satrapy. And this allowed them to defend the conquest because they always had people in the area that could actually start the defense before they needed to send a bigger legion in. So they were really, really smart about how they expanded. They also created this system of military roads. So when legionnaires weren't busy fighting, they were building roads and other things, defenses. But this facilitated communication. It also facilitated, during bad weather, the movement of troops. The first road went all the way down the length of Italy, called the Appian Highway. It's still there. You can still walk down it. It's still a major road, right? It leads into Rome. Leads to a phrase, all roads lead to Rome, which really, really was true because they had this network of roads leading all the way out in all the areas that they had taken. Trade was also then very facilitated. So you could have trade year round, whereas before you'd be stymied by weather and mud and all that. Nothing worse than trying to get an ox cart full of goods to Rome on a muddy field. They just didn't do it. But when you needed to march the army, it could make a beeline to wherever it needed to be. So it was a defense system. Oh, hey, you ready for this one? Let's fast forward to American history. When our troops took Germany in World War II, Eisenhower, the leader of our forces there, was pretty impressed with the Germans who had built a freeway system called the Autobahn, which allowed unlimited speeds, no stoplights, no stop signs from one end of the country to the other. We call that a freeway here in America today. So when he became president of the United States, and at the time it was the largest construction project in world history, built the freeway system you now know, I-15, I-80, crisscrossing Utah, connecting New York City to LA, San Francisco to Chicago, Chicago to New Orleans. The whole country now is this grid of roads. All roads lead to Rome. All roads, in this case, lead to Chicago. Chicago is kind of the hub of our transportation system. But without it, trucks used to have, I know this because my dad drove truck, would have to stop at every little town. They'd have speed traps, so they'd slow them down to 25 miles an hour, every little tiny town. It would take a month to get across the country. Eisenhower said, that's no good. In a time of war, we've got to get our troops across the country in a matter of a week at most. So we built the freeway system to do that, learning from the Romans. Germans adopted it. We adopted it. Way you go. All right, let's see, quick review. Yeah, well, we'll talk more about that later. Let's just jump ahead. Okay, so if you're looking at the boot of Italy, that the first people they're going to come into conflict with as they expand from the center will be the Etruscans to the north, who after a while they didn't have any problems with. They just took them because the Etruscans were weakened by attacks from Gaul. We explained that last time. But then it was the Greeks, and we explained how the wealthy Greeks at the boot would hire an army. So they hired this guy, Pyrrhus, Pyrrhus, who was the leader of a city-state. he had delusions of grandeur. He thought he was going to be another Alexander the Great. He was going to destroy the Romans and take over, whatever. Okay. But he comes in with 20,000 men, 80 war elephants, and this same phalanx that was perfected by Alexander the Great. And so these Romans are just going to be crumbled up in front of him, right? That happened. The Greeks won the battles against the Romans. Romans were very much outclassed, but they refused to make peace. They went back and raised another army. They came at him again and were defeated again. It happened a third time. Eventually, though, Pyrrhus gives up, leading to a term, the Pyrrhic victory, where you win the battles but still lose the war. In American history, we have a very good example of that, Vietnam War. Our American armed forces won every single battle in Vietnam, every single one. But we still lost the war. Again, that's not a topic for this class, but it's an example of a Pyrrhic victory, where you appear to be winning the battles, but there's conditions that are different that make that a lost cause, a lost effort. And so the Romans suddenly then found themselves taking over the boot of Italy, where they adopted a lot of Greek culture. That's what they did. They would adopt cultures and add it to their own, which was a pretty interesting Roman thing. So in contact with the Greeks, guess what they would get? New ideas. They would improve their language. They would improve their literature. They would get into this science thing. They would get into the cultural aspects of the Greeks, art, architecture, for example. They started using the same columns, only on a grander scale. What the Romans would do was take these beautiful buildings. Here's a temple in Syracuse, which is on Sicily, but it's Greek built. They would take that design and make it monumental, much bigger, much grander, and built to last. They also adopted a lot of the religious ideas. So they changed Zeus to Jupiter and so on, right? So they had a lot of the same early pagan religion. Then the philosophies, they loved the philosophy. There was one emperor, for example, who just went to Athens for the entire summer just to learn the philosophies of Diogenes and Plato. The Olympics was another thing that should be added to this list. So that became important. All right, now, here's the thing. Horace would say, he was another famous writer, he was a Greek, that the Greeks became captive, right? But then the Romans were considered their wild conquerors, were subdued by them. The Romans were very reluctant to take all of Greece because they respected him so much. But the Greeks were always this independent group and weren't willing to be allies. So as a result, the Romans would have to come in one by one and take them over. And they did it reluctantly. But then remember, the Romans are getting this cultural infusion, which we call the Hellenistic world. So the Romans are part of the Hellenistic movement by choice. So that's kind of an interesting story. So you should kind of know that. So now with the Greeks not an issue anymore for the Romans as far as conquest goes, the next big problem they faced were the Phoenicians. Now, we've talked about the Phoenicians before. Remember, these guys give us the phonetic alphabet. They give us all sorts of trade and products. They were one of the great powers of the Mediterranean. But this part of their empire was lost to the Persians. So anybody with any money or whatever moved to Carthage, and Carthage then becomes the center. And this is the center of trade in the Western Mediterranean. You can't basically get a ship, go from east to west and not pass this peninsula called Carthage, right? Very important. All right, well, so look at the power of Carthage and little tiny Rome here. Now, basically, the Phoenici is in Roman Punic. So this series of wars are called the Punic Wars, which are the wars against the Phoenicians, the people of Phoenician descent living in Carthage, all right? Carthage means the new city in Phoenician. So Carthage literally means the new city. We have this old city, Tyre. It's now been taken over by the Persians. Let's have this new city. And it was in a country we now call Tunisia, right? In North Africa. All right, it's an independent country right now, Tunisia. All right, founded by the Phoenician merchants from Tyre in the 9th century. So it had been around a while. Here's an aerial view of it today. And it's gone through quite a history, but it's a beautiful place. All right, the Carthaginian Empire established trading posts and cities throughout North Africa, Spain, Sicily, Sardinia, as you saw on the map. They even explored the coast of England. There's rumors that they maybe even circumnavigated Africa, which was like, oh, I don't know, let's say 1500 years before Vasco da Gama. Don't know if that's true or not, but there's some evidence that maybe they did. These were great sea people, right? And they were allies at first with the Romans when they were fighting the Greeks. When Pyrrhus was having his victories but losing the war, it appears that the merchants of Carthage, the new city, was helping the Romans somehow. That's kind of important to remember. Here's some ruins right here from Carthage. All right, so by the 7th century now, fast forward a couple hundred years, right? Phoenicia has lost its independence to Persia. So all of a sudden, we get all these refugees fleeing, coming across the Mediterranean, and establishing even a greater city, huge walls around it. They had some interesting religious practices too, which we won't go into, but some of those were a little sketchy. But nevertheless, the Phoenicians, of course, now had this huge trading empire. Now, basically, it is a group of merchants. So where the farming aristocrats ran Rome, the business class, the merchants class ran this. So the more you had trade, the more you made money, the more powerful of a leader you could be, right? So we have these powerful merchant families versus the Romans who have these farming families. Kind of an interesting contrast in cultures, isn't it? Well, the Punic Wars, right here, the word Phoenician in Latin, there were really 3 of them. So you need to know the Punic Wars, 1, 2, and 3. The first Punic War becomes the longest continuous war in the ancient world, in ancient history. Okay, so that's kind of important to know. And so here we have the field of battle. You can see this, it's this part of the Mediterranean. The Second Punic War would happen within about 20 years later. And then the Third Punic War was just a sad event where the Romans just decided to take revenge for no real apparent reason. But nonetheless, here's kind of what we've got. These are the major battle lines, but the First Punic War starts in, let's see, I'm going to jump ahead. Okay, it starts here in the island of Sicily because the Phoenicians had taken this half of the island, and the other half of the island was split between 2 Greek city-states, Messina and Syracuse. Now, this was the same place where the Athenians came to ruin in the Sicilian expedition, between the battle between Messina and Syracuse. One a Spartan ally, one an Athenian ally. Of course, that's now ancient history. But you got the Romans. Look how close the boot of Italy is to that little narrow strait crossing over to Messina. Messina is the gateway from the boot of Italy over to Sicily. Now, if you take Sicily, look how close you are to Carthage. So this is a very strategic island. It was a strategic island in World War II as well, because as American troops came across the north of Africa here, British troops came across the north of Africa here, they met in this spot, crushed the German army here in Tunisia, and then one of our generals, Patton, helped lead the invasion, and he was determined to take Messina because he knew Messina was the #1 spot. By the way, Patton, you should know, believed he was a general way back in history, or at least a soldier, and he was at these battles that we talk about. So, a little different, but he was one of our truly great generals. But nonetheless, we would fight at this same city, this same place in World War II, because this then is how you conquer Italy, which was a German ally. So history kind of repeats itself, doesn't it? So we kind of try to bring the past to the present here. But let's take a little bit bigger view. It was a clash of interests, basically, between the existing Carthaginian Empire, which was expanding, and the Roman Republic, which was expanding too. And the first collision point for them right here is Sicily. Now, what you have is a classic battle, which we talked about before, between the shark and the lion. The Romans were good fighters on land. They'd proven themselves now against the Greeks. But they weren't much at sea. As far as fighters, though, Carthaginians fought with mercenaries. They hired soldiers, like rent a soldier. whereas the Romans had a citizen army, but no navy. So wait a minute. As last I saw, Sicily was an island, right? So that's going to be a little problem. The Romans had this unnatural fear based on some of their religious teachings about gods in the ocean, and that particularly didn't like Romans, I guess. I don't know. But at any rate, it began again with a conflict between Messina, which was this city state, and down here you can see in green, Syracuse, and the rest of the islands controlled by the Phoenicians. Messina then enlisted the aid of the Carthaginian navy on their behalf against Syracuse, but then turned on them and went to Rome for aid. Oops. So they started with one side, switched, went to the other. So that meant Carthage now is going to support Syracuse. So, and now they've invited the Romans in. So what you have are two superpowers in the region being pulled into a local conflict. The conflict was between Messina and Syracuse, not between Rome and Carthage, but both sides got sucked into the war. That happens a lot. A minor little conflict. Well, let's take, for example, Korea, the Korean War. The North Koreans invade the South Koreans. We get sucked into it. So do the Chinese. Before you know it, we're fighting a war between two superpowers, the United States and China. By the way, China was supported by Russia, the Soviet Union, and Korea is still in a stalemate, where a small power, two small countries, suck in the bigger powers. So we see in history that this lesson is learned again and again and again. All right, well, now they're in a battle. The Romans then sent a garrison to Messina to help out. The outraged Carthaginians lend aid to Syracuse. As I said, the two powers now get involved. Tensions escalated, and it turned into full-scale war. But the Romans knew they had to build a navy in order to take an island. They built one, and it got totally destroyed in a storm. Does that sound familiar? They built another, and they engaged the Carthaginians at Argentum, which is like a little place in the ocean off the coast. And they got clobbered. It wasn't even fair. The Romans suffered dearly for their inexperience. They spent the next 4 years rebuilding their navy again, and they came again and again were defeated. They spent years more rebuilding the navy again. The thing with the Romans, they're like this Hydra. They never quit. They never stop. They're a little bit like the Terminator, if you've seen any of the Terminator movies. They lose another battle off the Lipari Islands, and they build another navy. So this is why this war is so long, because it took 2 years and 4 years and more years to keep building these warships. And so here's the thing, right? You can't storm a beach without a navy. The Carthaginians could come and go at will and storm the beach and do a raid and then head back out to sea. Within 2 months, the Romans had over 100 warships that they built, but they couldn't outsail the Carthaginians, and so they lose that battle at Lipari, which I just told you about. All right, now, here's the thing. They finally expand their navy again, but then they added a new technology. They said, we can't fight these guys at sea. They knock our oars over, they ram us, they go back, we sink, we die, they live. So they created this bridge. You see it here? It's kind of like a drawbridge, if you will, but it's connected right here, like it's tied to the ship. And it's got almost nails, big heavy spikes at the end. And they would then get close to the Carthaginian ship and drop this down. It would literally nail itself to the Carthaginian ship. It would fall with such heavy weight. And then they'd storm their legions across that bridge and fight a battle, as if it were a battle on land. So they were using what they knew best, land fighting, and they found a way to deploy that at sea. That is pretty clever. It kind of goes back to the story of who? Let's go back. Don't mean to go back this far usually, but there you go. Of Horatius. Give me a bridge, and one Roman can take on any number of mercenary troops, right? And so they created a bridge. So as I jump back into the battle here, as we see it, yeah, there we go. So this then brings their Carthaginian ship to a standstill. The Carthaginian ship can't sail away. It can't row its way out of trouble. It's now stuck. It has a claw holding it to the side of the Roman ship. And the Romans can then use, of course, archery, and they can also use their swords or javelins to fight. Okay, so now here's the thing. Suddenly, the Carthaginian advantage at sea has now been eliminated or greatly reduced. Then what follows is nearly an unbroken string of Roman victories. Carthage then realizes that the game is up. They then sue for peace. They sign a peace treaty. They give all of Sicily over to Rome, and then they pay a massive tribute. In other words, pay us for the war you caused us. And suddenly Rome now was collecting a tribute from the very rich Carthaginians. This war destabilized Carthage. The mercenary troops weren't getting paid as much now because guess what? The war's kind of over. And all, by the way, we gave a whole bunch of money to the Romans. So their own mercenary army rebelled against them. So they had to get other mercenaries to fight the other mercenaries in order to keep the mercenaries. Don't depend on mercenaries because they're only fighting for the money. So the Carthaginians then go through a period of destabilization where their own army, which was bought and sold, people from other places, turned against them. All right, now Rome then expanded and conquered these two islands, Sardinia and Corsica. Corsica, of course, is where Napoleon was born. So that becomes a very important place in history later on. The Romans then also conquered this part of what we now call France. Now, this means they're kind of moving up the coastline, right? Which is kind of pretty cool. Look at them expand. They already got Greece. You can see Greece over here. Greece was either allies or had been conquered. So now they're expanding. So the Carthaginians decide to expand too. And so they send a merchant family, goes over and starts to basically take over tribal areas in what we now call Spain, the Iberian Peninsula. This is the beginning of the civilization of Spain, where they become part of, the Western world. Spain does. Of course, you know how important Spain was in 1492 and beyond, right, to the conquest of America and to the history of the world. But Spain wasn't Spain yet. Spaniards weren't Spaniards. Spaniards were just a bunch of tribes like everywhere else with no real understanding of what Spain was all about. It wasn't Spain. It was Carthaginian holdings now being taken over. And the Romans decide to come down this coastline even further. So here it is, 2100 BC. There was a city in between the two called Sargentum. And both get to that city at about the same time. And guess what? The war starts again. So this is now the second Punic Wars. The Romans are already seeing the Mediterranean as their own personal lake. They called it Mare Nostrum in Latin, which means our sea. Now, the Roman Navy could now prevent an amphibious landing by anybody from attacking Italy. They weren't still that great at sea, but they now had neutralized that. But they were able now to control the sea routes for trade. So they were starting to figure it out in terms of sea trade. And they could use their ships to help invade others. All right, Carthage then, during the period between the wars, had solved that mercenary war thing, and they got their finances going again with the riches from Hispania, the Iberian Peninsula, Spain. So they were now back on track. Now, there's no reason why these two powers couldn't have lived in harmony, but guess what? At this point now, it's a blood feud. In fact, there was a leader who, from the Barca family, B-A-R-C-A, which means thunder. Oh, we done? All right, well, this is probably a good place to stop. We'll do the Second Punic War later. So I'm going to just stop this right now, and you'll have to log back in because I'm going to record this lecture and I have to end this in order for it to process. So I'll be back in about 4 minutes.
Okay, bye. Thank you.
Thank you.